Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. This week, bringing you a special American Probation and Parole Association edition. As the voice of the community corrections industry, APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. In addition to their U.S. members, the American Probation and Parole Association is supported by international members who are actively involved in strengthening community corrections work in their own countries. APPA's International Relations Committee aims to connect community corrections professionals around the world to inspire and share insights from their unique experiences and best practices. Welcome to this special APPA episode of The Criminologist. And now, welcome your host, Joseph Arvidson.
Hello and welcome to episode 217 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. I am so excited to introduce my guest to you all. Jaron Harvey is the Director of Rehabilitation and Community Supervision, joining us all the way from his home in Turks and Caicos. Jaron has been on the front lines of transforming probation and parole in the Caribbean, and today we are diving deep into his inspiring journey and the innovative strides he's making in criminal justice reform. Jaron's story is one of leadership, vision, and commitment to change. Over his 12-year career, he has spearheaded several initiatives aimed at improving outcomes for clients in probation and parole. Now, in our conversation, we explore how his team in Turks and Caicos is implementing evidence-based practices, such as the Risk-Needs-Responsivity model. And we're also going to look at some of those specific implementation strategies, particularly around the work they've done with the STICS model. Jaron is also going to shed some light on some of the unique challenges faced by probation and parole departments in small island nations such as his, and how they are working to overcome these through staff training, community collaboration, and of course, good old-fashioned communication. We also touch on Jaron's efforts to establish a Caribbean Association of Probation and Parole aimed at connecting probation and parole departments across the region for shared learning, training, and the development of culturally relevant risk assessments, among other things. Jaron's dedication to collaboration is truly inspiring as he works towards making systemic changes that will benefit not just his team, but the entire criminal justice system in Turks and Caicos. This conversation is packed with insights on the power of trauma-informed care, dynamic security, and the importance of building strong relationships with clients. It's about more than just supervision. It's about empowering clients to change their lives and take ownership of their futures. Let's jump into my conversation with Jaron Harvey, where we discuss the intersection of policy, practice, and purpose in probation and parole, and what the future holds for criminal justice reform in the Caribbean. Please enjoy my conversation with Jaron Harvey, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Jaron. Great to have you here as the Director of Rehabilitation and Community Supervision down in Turks and Caicos. We are fascinated by the prospect of probation and parole spreading their wings globally, and welcome to the community, as it were. Before we kick it off, tell us a little bit about yourself, what your career trajectory was like, what your pathway looked like, I guess both educationally and vocationally. sort of your ascent, and then we'll unpack what probation is like down in Turks and Caicos for the listener.
Well, thank you so much for the kind welcome. As you would have alluded to, I am currently in the Turks and Caicos, where the sun is shining brightly and the palm trees are swaying, and our beautiful turquoise waters is awaiting the entire world to grace our shores. So for me, I received both my bachelor's and master's degree from the United States of America. I attended the great Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach, Florida, go Wildcats, where I got my bachelor's degree in sociology, and where I was actually introduced to probation and parole and got my feet wet. Prior to that, I had no knowledge about what probation or parole was all about. And then I decided to get my master's degree from Walden University, where I specialized in forensic psychology. And so for the most part, my entire career has been around social services and then probation and parole. And so my first job, I kind of applied to become a probation officer. And they told me that there wasn't really any vacancy, but that there was a strong need for men to become a social worker. And so there was a vacancy there, and they suggested that I get my feet wet and become a social worker. So I applied, and I entered to become a social worker for a few months, but I did not feel like that was where my passion lies. But then when I applied, there was an opening in the probation department where I was ultimately transferred, and I got my feet actually wet by becoming a probation officer. And I've been a probation officer for the past 12 years by heart. And I believe that that's where I'm called to be. And that's where I'm most passionate about, helping people who are entangled in the criminal justice system to find different pathways and different routes to become a law-abiding citizen and to live crime-free lives.
I love that resume that you just outlaid there, and really the passion that you bring, that of a change agent wanting to help people, which is where globally we know the field is going. We're realizing that the traditional approach around more of a containment, surveillance, dare I say, law enforcement background isn't really the recipe for success we're looking for. It's individuals like you that bring that change agent to the table. I'm fascinated. I love comparing and contrasting other systems, particularly probation and parole systems. I've been beyond blessed to have traveled a bit and surveyed some other jurisdictions around the globe and how they deliver their probation and parole services. First off, I'm just curious, what is the size of your department down there? How many probation officers do you have in your department? What are those caseload size looks at? Again, I'm just looking at this through the lens of an American probation officer. What might that look like in your neck of the woods, as we say up here in Minnesota?
Yeah, so we have about 6 probation officers on staff, and we don't have specialized units yet. And I want to place special emphasis on the yet, because we're heading toward that. But so all of our staff provide generalized work where they supervise both probation and parole. And the average caseload is around 20 per an individual. And keeping in mind that we consider ourselves to be the infant in probation and parole departments in the entire world, because we were recently founded in 2023. And prior to that, we were the Probation and Rehabilitation Unit under the Department of Social Development in 2019. Which is where we were initially created when the government passed the alternative sentencing ordinance, and they wanted to create different pathways for the court to consider alternative sentencing as opposed to just sending people to prison, especially for nonviolent offenses or offenses where it would have been better served for the individual to be in the community.
Let me ask you this, and I assume this is the case, but there's likely an adherence to the risk-need-responsivity framework. I come from a training background, and I always think the devil's in the details when we implement any type of R&R related framework. What's that experience been like for you and your staff, building that body of knowledge around those global principles, risk, need, responsivity?
I think the beauty of starting late in the game is that you get to learn from previous agencies' mistakes. So there is a wealth of information about what works in offender management practices in the entire world. In different continents, you can go as far as researching information in the United Kingdom, in the United States, even as far as Singapore, and even within the Caribbean. So for us, we were able to review some of the best practices from around the world as to what works. And we consider the R&R model to be the Bible as to what we base all of our supervision practices by. And so we have conduct standards that are geared towards those R&R principles that help us to tailor our interventions towards our clients' learning styles and their motivation, and then also providing more intensive supervision for those who pose us the greatest risk of reoffending, and then even trying to identify what are those criminogenic needs for us to tackle and to address during our treatment approach towards these clients. And we utilize here the LSCMI, which we've introduced in 2019, and we're one of the very few countries in the Caribbean who started it first, who were first introduced to it by MHS with the level of services case management inventory that we've been using since 2019 inside the Turks and Caicos Islands. And then also the YLS, which is the youth level of service case management inventory. And we are actually in the process of collecting data over a period of 5 years so that we can actually validate that in the context of the Turks and Caicos. And then we've also been using the Static 99R, which is the risk assessment for sex offenders inside the Turks and Caicos for the past 5 years that we've been utilizing it. But the predominant tool that we use almost on a day-to-day basis is the LSCMI, and then also the YLSCMI, which are the tools that help us to identify these issues, to identify these clients who require intensive supervision in comparison to those who are low risk, who don't necessarily need intensive supervision or intensive services.
I happen to be a master trainer of the LSCMI. I did not know how you're going to respond to that question when I asked it, because I was going to ask what assessment tool you're using. So we're kindred spirits in that. I love the LSCMI. I'm trained in the YLS as well. I just think, as you said, it's one of the elite tools out there in the R&R framework, which then brings me to my next question. I was recently speaking with a mutual connection of ours, Dr. Guy Burgon. He was actually a guest on the podcast a few episodes ago, and he and I often will joke with each other about where we're dusting off our passports to go train next. And he mentioned Turks and Caicos. So tell me about your experiences with Guy. I assume he's down there training you and your staff on the STICS model that he and Dr. Banta developed. But I would love to hear what that experience has been like with STICS down in Turks and Caicos.
Yeah, so Dr. Guy, who we actually met through our sister department, which is the Department of Community Rehabilitation in the Cayman Islands, where the STICS model is currently implemented, has been implemented and is currently in use. And we were quite pleased about the success the Cayman Islands were reaping as a result of the STICS model that was introduced. And so they actually connected us to Guy, who was being a breath of fresh air and a strength of resource for us, even here in the context of the Turks and Caicos. And so because we are a very small staff, we kind of develop a platform where we don't necessarily just come and provide training over a period of 5 days, but we develop a systematic approach where persons are trained over a period of 5 days, followed by coaching, so that they can actually put the tools and the resources and the information that they've learned from Dr. Guy, put it into practice. And then he can actually coach them on how they can enhance, how they can improve their interventions with the clients and with our clients. And so over a period of 6 months, he will be providing coaching. And then it is intended for him to come back to provide reinforcement and a refresher training after that 6 months, followed by another 6 months, because we want to be intentional to make sure that our staff are very confident in the work that they are doing. And then they have the competency to also deliver the rehabilitative programs and the software and the interventions that we need to help our clients to live crime-free lives and to actually reduce their criminogenic needs and address these issues that are the driving forces behind criminal behavior in our country. So the STICS model we know is something that is based on evidence. And one of the things that we try to adopt is that everything we want to implement, we need to know what's the science behind it. Is it working? If it's not working, we don't necessarily need to explore it. but we want to replicate what is working in other countries into the context of the Turks and Caicos so that we can also reap those benefits to ensure that our clients can live their best lives in terms of becoming crime-free.
I love that you noted you're a little bit late to the party, but you can reap the benefits of what those of us who are not new to the party have learned as far as you noticed or noted rather, interventions that don't work, approaches that aren't necessarily evidence-based, and learning from our mistakes. And you could just come in and, like you said, tap into somebody like Guy and implement his evidence-based practice model STICS, which I believe for the listener stands for Strategic Training and Community Supervision. Yeah. I know I ran into an individual. I was training a few years back over in Barcelona, and one of the students was from Sweden. And I know that they've done a lot of work in Sweden with STICS. For the listeners, Jaron, who might not be as familiar with STICS, maybe give them a short version on what those interventions look like, or really, if it's possible, at least give an abbreviated version of what's really behind that model. One of the big things I loved about it was how he utilized the activity that he called Spot the Dog to get individuals to simply recognize that they and they alone control their thoughts, and their thoughts and their thoughts alone control their behaviors. But as he's been telling me for years, Joe, if probation officers can simply get their clients to understand that all elusive thought behavior link, then it's a cakewalk, as we say. And one of his team members came up with this fun little activity that they called Spot the Dog, which really resonated with clients to get them to understand that simple concept. But maybe share some of your experience with that, and or talk about some of the interventions if people are curious about what this STICS model is all about.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Spot the Dog, which has been one of the highlight of the training with the staff, because once it was introduced, they gravitated toward it and they ran with it. And then one of the other amazing things that was introduced is colors, helping people to identify the color of their attitude. But the STICS model is basically applying the R&R theory and helping clients to change the way that they think that would ultimately change their attitude. And so it's heavily based under the premises of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, where we're changing the way that you think, you can ultimately change your behavior. So for implementing the STICS, it's helping clients. How do you engage a client to identify and to address some of their negative thought patterns? How do you adjust and you actually stop some of these negative thought patterns that are contributing to the criminal behavior, and helping you realize that that all of our negative behavior stems from the way that we think. And if we can ultimately change the way that we think, we can influence our behavior. And so for us, we have adjusted our focus to where we are honing in on those areas of our clients so that we can get them to enhance their thinking, so that they may not have so that they don't possess a criminal thinking, they don't possess that criminal thinking or that attitude of entitlement or belief that the system is corrupt and the entire world is to get them, but being able to identify these negative traps and then helping them to transform them into positive thoughts that can ultimately change their behavior. So that whole process is giving the staff the tools and the resources and the skills, rather, as to how they can engage clients in a one-to-one session or even in a group session, how to do that role clarification, how to do that role-playing exercises to help the client to reach to that place where they can understand and identify where their issues are and then what needs to be done to resolve those issues. So in summary, in my own way, that's what STICS is to me.
I often tell the story. The first time I met Guy, he was presenting at a conference in Reno, Nevada, I want to say maybe. It was ICCA, International Community Corrections Association. But he talked about Spot the Dog back then. And I was so fascinated by it that after everybody else has left the plenary session, I like a doughy-eyed child, stayed behind to, can I have your autograph type thing. But he literally took the time and sketched out Spot the Dog on a napkin for me. Yeah. And I'll never forget this at the time. He said, Joe, we have to take the gobbledygook out of what we do. We too often spend so much time trying to impress our colleagues or somebody else at the university about these big concepts and fancy terms we have. But by the time that works its way down to the boots on the ground staff member, you're losing so much in translation. And so again, with Spot the Dog, I think that's where it resonates, is it's just a real simple, and I hate that term dumbing down because it's not that, but it's responsivity. It's responsivity. He's saying it in a way that the client, or in this case, the practitioner, is gonna relate to
and understand. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know we have another mutual connection out there in Julie Trishelle. I know Julie from my work on the International Relations Committee for the American Probation and Parole Association. Julie is the head of what's known as the SAW Project, Supervision Around the World, in which I think she interviewed you for her 2-minute insights, Jaron, but I'll let you speak to that. What is your relationship been with Julie Trishelle?
But I remember sitting in on one of the workshops that she facilitated at the American Probation and Parole Association conference. I believe it was in 2021 in Boston. I sat in on one of the presentations that she was doing, and how she was talking about the roadmap as to how she got where she is today, and the data she's collecting about what are the supervision practices that are going on around the world. So I haven't met her, or she haven't interviewed me, but I'm aware of the SAW project because I participated, or not participated, but I attended one of the workshops that she facilitated, I believe, in 2021 at APPA conference. But that's the gist of what I gathered from she was presenting.
Okay.
She presented, statistics and information on what other countries were doing in terms of the best practices for probation and best practices for parole, or best practice in general regarding supervision.
Okay.
She apparently wanted to be that, I guess, that conduit where all of probation and parole agencies and their best practices from around the world, being able to absorb that into one database so that it can eventually be shared, and resources can be shared, and information can be collected, that people can learn from what's going on in Africa, or in the UK, or in the USA, or in China, or in Singapore, or any other country, being able to find what are they doing in terms of supervision, and how she can support that, and how she can collect that information and have it in one shared database.
Which is really what I'm all about here on the podcast too, is just sharing those perspectives. Really, I think we have so much to learn just from perspective sharing, or even from, you mentioned the LSCMI, even to steal some language there. I often say it's really all about like sharing normative feedback and letting other practitioners know, for example, they're doing R&R down in Turks and Caicos, or, they're doing Spot the Dog in Sweden. I think it helps sometimes, at least from my perspective, when there's either resistive staff or either cultures that need to be shifted because they're not as open to change, but to point out to people, and again, I'm thinking of normative feedback, where they fall on a continuum really does help folks sort of search their ambivalence, and it does help move the needle. Yeah. You mentioned the Caribbean down there. I was presenting at the World Congress in Amsterdam, and I know I met some of your colleagues from the Caribbean who were at the conference. Just give us an idea of what that sort of neighborhood is like down there in the Caribbean. I don't want to speak for other listeners here in the US, but I imagine for some folks, it's novel to them to even consider, of course they must have probation and parole systems in the Caribbean. What's that like, I guess, sort of from a regional standpoint, Jaron?
I'm happy that you mentioned it, because just September 9th through the 11th, I actually traveled to Barbados, where I attended the launch of the Caribbean Association of Probation and Parole, which it will be the regional association that will link all of the probation and parole departments together, so that we can do research, that we can facilitate training, that we can come together annually to chart the way forward and develop what would we like to see being developed in terms of risk assessment from a Caribbean standpoint. Because a lot of what we rely on is usually from Canada, from the US, or from the United Kingdom. And so whenever we're looking for research, we depend heavily on these countries' research to guide some of the interventions that we want to implement in our country. So CAPP, that we call it, it would help to conduct research from the Caribbean context and to strengthen probation and parole regionally, and helping those countries who may not have a empirical risk assessment in their tool, being able to link and to develop tools that are easily accessible for those countries who may not be able to afford the LSCMI, but we understand the importance of a risk assessment. So a part of that, in September, we were there for about 4 days. And so 2 days was the actual conference where we've heard from presenters and we've had meetings about how we're going to develop a constitution to govern the CAPP. And then the following 2 days, we actually spent time discussing what do we need to develop culturally relevant risk assessments that are applicable in the Turks and Caicos or in the Caribbean region. Because one of the things that we have to understand is that a lot of the risk assessments is based on the culture of the country of origin. But language sometimes different, language matters. A word that we may use in our context may be offensive in another person's context. So we have to keep all of those things into perspective. And so for us, forming the Caribbean Association of Probation and Parole is fundamental in championing the resources and the knowledge and the information sharing from a Caribbean and regional standpoint. And I'm happy to report that there is great buy-in and great support from our regional supporters. And so it's actually next year, the conference will be held in St. Lucia, September. And then in 2026, it will be held in the Turks and Caicos. So this is an invitation for everyone to schedule September 2026 to come down to the Turks and Caicos to attend the 3rd Annual Caribbean Association of Probation and Parole. And we have about in excess of 20 Caribbean countries who are actually participating and are on board. And directors who meet every month who are in agreement and in full support of this endeavor. And so it was launched in Barbados, and then next year it will be in St. Lucia, and the following year it will be in Turks and Caicos. But the intent is for us to boost and to raise awareness about probation and parole, because even so, in our context, there are still a lot of people in our countries who don't understand what is it that we do. Probation and parole is somewhat, people don't have an understanding. So usually in America or in Canada, if you ask someone, have you ever heard about probation and parole? They would say, I don't really know much, but I've watched it in a movie, or I heard an actor say, I've watched the movie and I saw someone where I can see my parole officer, my probation officer. Right. The same doesn't really apply for us in the Caribbean. And so because there's a lack of information, sometimes people just don't understand the power that probation have in the entire criminal justice system. During the presentation, one of the presenters coined it that probation is basically the heart of an effective criminal justice system, that without it, the criminal justice system will die. And I thought that was so true in the Caribbean context, that in order for us to reduce crime and to help our clients to live a better life and to become crime-free, we have to empower and support probation in that respect.
That is music to my ears as an implementation science advocate. And I hear what you're saying about sort of getting over that public relations hump, or that public awareness hump about what probation and parole really is even all about. I guess my follow-up question would be, yes, of course, that needs to be the case with the public at large, but what's your experience been like with your other criminal justice stakeholders, Jaron, and their biases or preconceived notions of probation? For example, the judiciary. I mean, I know here we talk about the fact that we could have our entire agencies trained up in STICS and all be LSCMI master trainers, but if our judges aren't on board, we'll still go into court and they recommend conditions around, for example, employment or substance abuse, when we know, Judge, it's about the big four. Let's tackle their maladaptive thinking habits and their risky thinking habits. with a newer, fresh slate, as you will, what's that like trying to inform your partners in the justice space about probation or parole?
One of the unique things that we have inside the Turks and Caicos is something that is called the Criminal Justice Stakeholders Group. And so that group is comprised of the Chief Justice, who is actually the head of the judiciary, the Attorney General, the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Commissioner of Police, the Superintendent of the prison, the Director of Probation and Parole, which is me, the Director of Social Services, and then the Chief Magistrate. So on a monthly basis, all 8 of these individuals, and I forgot to add that the President of the Bar Association, which represents the legal fraternity in terms of the lawyers in the Turks and Caicos context, on a monthly basis, all of us sit around the table to discuss what are the issues that are confronting our criminal justice system and strategize on plans that we can use to develop and address those issues. So because I have access to the head of these agencies, it makes the role and my job a little bit easier. So just yesterday, just over the weekend, I was able to submit a report to the Chief Justice on the statistics that we have received over the last 5 years from the court, and strategize on plans as to how we can improve and increase on those referrals and identifying those gaps. I was only able to do that because it was identified that this was an issue at a meeting. And so now a plan is being developed. Likewise, the prison superintendent who may have issues for persons who are coming to prison, he can bring up those issues. And the commissioner of police who may have issues in terms of cases being heard in a timely manner. So this group that we consider to be the engine of the criminal justice system helps us to address issues head on. And we sit around a table sometimes over dinner, and there is a constitution that was developed that governs all of what we do from this perspective, that helps to empower all of the work that we do. And it is actually chaired by the Chief Justice, who continues to have this meeting on a regular basis and to ask and have our staff send emails to us finding out what is it that we want to focus on the agenda. One of the issues that we had was the breach process. One of the issues that we were facing is that we would file a breach report, and sometimes 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months later, the matter is still pending before the court. I was able to bring that before this committee as an issue, and the Chief Justice commissioned a breach process rules committee, which was comprised of the magistrates, people from my office, people from the public prosecution office, and people from the police. And we developed breach process rules that are now binding. It dictates what the court must be, what the court must do. It dictates what my office must do, what the police must do, and it gives timelines for when it should happen. So now, as a result of that, breach process are being concluded within a matter of 48 hours. So we went from having months-long issues to it being resolved within 48 hours. So I think that's one of the beauty of what we have inside the Turks and Caicos that I'm happy that we have, but I realize that a lot of countries don't have that opportunity to have the connection or to be up close and personal with some of the people who heads their stuff. And I think it speaks to the collective buy-in from all of those agencies and all of those individuals who are supportive of one mission, which is to enhance and improve the criminal justice system and make sure that it is fair for all of the individuals involved, but ultimately making sure that although some people may need to be punished, making sure that rehabilitation is at the core of everything that is being done. And so that's one of the beauty that we have inside of Turks and Caicos, which is the formation of the Criminal Justice Stakeholders Group that I'm happy to be a part of.
I know that there are so many listeners jealous of that Criminal Justice Stakeholders Group because you hit the nail on the head of why so many of our initiatives fail. I mean, we just know from general project management studies that most projects fail because of one reason, and that's lack of communication. And you're addressing that head on. I just love how you spoke to that, that sense of sort of CQI, continuous quality improvement, and how you shortened the span down, for example, when probation is breached. It must just be nice, Jaron, that it's almost like you've got this smaller criminal justice ecosystem that you can work within. And you've just got such a great relationship with those other stakeholders and partners that, again, you've almost got like your own almost criminal justice playground there, because it's such a small ecosystem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think because we're a small country, and so that close knittedness is still there. But we still have challenges within our criminal justice system. But the beauty of it is that we sit around the table and we are working to address those challenges day by day. And I think a lot of times we see challenges, but we never discuss them. We never develop a plan to address them. And so for us, this group realized that in order for us to be effective, we have to, one, pool our resources together. Two, we have to work together, because in order for us to be successful, we're dependent on the judiciary, we're depending on the police, we're depending on the prosecution, we're depending on the prison. So all of these agencies are intertwined closely together. And so it's imperative for us to have those relationships and for them to realize that we are an equal partner in justice in the Turks and Caicos Islands.
I'm trying to envision a typical day, if there is such a thing, for one of your probation officers. You mentioned earlier that a lot of people, for better or worse, get their idea of what a probation system looks like from movies and TV. And I think for a lot of listeners, they might think, well, down in the paradise of Turks and Caicos, what could they possibly be doing on a probation and parole caseload? And I don't want you to necessarily speak with broad strokes, but, generally speaking, what types of offenses are your folks dealing with? Are there trends down there that are more contextual to that region that you might be dealing with? Or, like I said, what's that sort of typical day maybe look like supervising individuals on those caseloads?
So the majority of cases we are getting is drug related, where we have a lot of persons who are being charged with possession of marijuana because it is still illegal, and cocaine. But we're also seeing cases of a lot of theft and some burglary. And we're seeing cases of outright defiance and disrespecting a police officer or resisting arrest or obstructing justice, meaning preventing someone from carrying out justice. We're also seeing a lot of assaults in terms of fighting in a public place. But what we are also seeing that is just not unique to the context of the Turks and Caicos, but worldwide, is that the majority of our clients are 25 and under. So we are seeing, for a lot of our clients, their first interaction with the criminal justice system, just for a simple offense as maybe stealing alcohol out of a grocery store for $40. When we conduct a risk assessment, these individuals are being scored high. And what we are finding in comparison to 2019 is that now people first interaction with the criminal justice system, they're being scored high, and they have so many criminogenic needs that needs to be addressed. 5 years ago, a lot of the people we were seeing were being scored low, because what we were servicing were older adults at that particular time, persons who were 30 and over. And we know that research has proven that the older you get, the more likelihood of your risk coming down. But what we are finding is that a lot of our young people are being introduced to the criminal justice system for the very first time, but they are being scored as high, and they have so many issues. And on the face of it, you would not assume or perceive that someone being charged with just a minor offense would have so many other issues that can also predict their likelihood of reoffending. So that's one of the things that we are finding inside the Turks and Caicos context, that our clients, that many of them are being scored high risk. So a lot of times the numbers are low in terms of caseload, but the work that the probation officers are doing is as if they're carrying a caseload of maybe 60 individuals, because a lot of these individuals are high risk. So they require to see them more. They're doing a lot of referrals. And so I like to use, I think it's Dr. Brian Lawrence, he quoted it best. We adopted that coaching model. So on one hand, we're like a coach, but on the other hand, we have to provide that surveillance aspect, which is a balanced approach to make sure we're not doing one more than the other, but balancing the act. So what we do is that we're seeing that a lot of our clients are being scored as high risk, and it's almost rare for us to experience those individuals who are low risk, which is quite contrary to what we were seeing in the early phases when we were introduced to the risk assessment.
What you just articulated, Jaron, it really exemplifies something that we know from the psychology of criminal conduct. I was just giving a talk a week or so ago, and it was sort of, introduction to risk-needs-responsivity. But when I was talking about the risk principle, I was thinking to myself that many veteran corrections staff, or certainly even folks in leadership positions, don't realize what you just described. They still tend to equate the severity of the offense with the risk score. They think, well, it's a heinous crime. It's a horrible crime. And what you just spelled out through your little bit of research showed just the opposite. Like, no, we're seeing that offense severity doesn't correlate to criminogenic variables, and it shouldn't. But it's just that easy thing for the public, or like I said, even administrators, I think, to just equate the crime severity with the probability of reoffending.
Agreed. I agree.
I wanted to ask you also, I have been doing a lot of work. I mentioned I was in The Hague at the World Congress. I was actually over there with my colleague, Nicole Kimberly Staley. We are presenting on a supervision model that she and I created, which we've entitled TIDES, which is short for trauma-informed desistance. And we built this model after our collective 60 plus years in corrections. We view it almost as an overlay of the R&R model, because in our experience, we were seeing certain things, I guess I'll say, insufficiently addressed. And one of those was the role of trauma in the R&R framework, which I know historically that's always been viewed as a responsivity consideration, but I know it's almost pre-criminogenic, or I could give an argument of that. And then, of course, also desistance. I've fallen in love with desistance theory, and at least here in the United States or North America, desistance theory hasn't really caught on as much as the R&R theory. You mentioned pathways earlier, Jaron, when you were talking about your experiences, and I love using the metaphor of pathways to talk about how the R&R framework is great at examining and assessing and extinguishing those pathways into crime. But we're missing half of the equation if we don't look at those pathways out of crime, which are those desistance correlates. So that's what we tried to do in the TIDES model. But I'm curious, I'll take a step back. In the Caribbean, in Turks and Caicos, how are those topics of either being trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and or desistance theory gaining any traction?
We're all about being trauma-informed as a department. In fact, we introduced a high school speech competition this year as a way of creating awareness about the role of the department and the work that we do. And the title or the theme of the speech competition was Understanding Trauma, the Key to Effective Offender Rehabilitation. And so we had high school students actually presented speeches on how trauma play a role in effective offender rehabilitation. So for us, we realize, which is why one of our focus for next year, training-wise, is actually certifying our staff in trauma-informed care. We realize for a lot of our clients, when we do the ACE score, they are being scored high. They have so many adverse childhood experiences, and many of them are afraid to touch topics. And when you scale back and you do a social history on their childhood, you are seeing so many issues or so many red flags that for us, were actually contributed to them being introduced to the whole entire criminal justice system. And so we believed that from a prevention standpoint, that if these red flags were addressed and identified while they were in high school and elementary school, it is likely that these individuals would have not been entangled in the criminal justice system. So for us, we are all about trying to be trauma-informed because we deal with a lot of juveniles, and we've recently seen an increase in female juveniles. And it's almost like you develop a board and you look at all of these individuals and you look at key factors among all of these juveniles who are offending and all of these adults, one of the key factors or one of the overwhelming themes that you would see in all of their cases and all of them is trauma. Trauma. And we can't run around it. We can't get away from it. And in order for us to address the issues and ensure that they are able to go on to become a law-abiding citizen, we have to address that trauma. Because sometimes, for me, I realize like trauma is one of those things that can live in our subconscious mind, and it can actually have a way as to how we respond to certain situations. And so I've heard someone say that some people are built on love and some people are built on survival. Whatever it is, how people are built. If trauma is deeply entrenched into our subconscious mind, we will see the world differently. We will respond to situations differently. And a lot of times, how we respond to these incidents that led us to the criminal justice system is as a result of how we interpret things from our traumatic lens. And because these persons have so much trauma in their life and in their child in terms of abuse, witnessing abuse inside their families. As a matter of fact, we conducted a national survey last year where we surveyed the entire public school system in our country. And what we found was that 35% of our high school students scored high on the adverse childhood experience. They scored high on that. So what that is telling the government is that what we need to do is to divert a lot of resources in prevention, because we see the connection between those who have extensive trauma that go on to be unaddressed, that these are the individuals who are actually going on to commit crimes and then are becoming entangled in the criminal justice system. So from a long-term perspective, if we want to reduce crime, we need to double our efforts from prevention in terms of ensuring that our teachers, our guidance counselors, and all of the social workers and all those persons involved in that care, that they are informed from a trauma perspective and that they are actually putting into practice. So for us, because we want our clients to be equipped with the skills to become a law-abiding citizen, we realize that our probation officers has to also be certified in trauma-informed care, because these persons, for the majority of these clients, the probation officers is probably the only positive individual in their life. Sometimes these are the only individuals who they trust. And sometimes these are the only individuals who actually help to identify some of the trauma that occurred in their childhood or that occurred in their past. And so helping the staff to be equipped to address these issues is one of the fundamental things that I want to focus on for DRCX next year, which is for us to become certified in trauma-informed care.
I absolutely love that approach you take. And I heard so many great things, up to including when you talked about the value of importing a sense of trust and safety. One of the many things I discovered when researching and educating myself on trauma was so much of the neuroscience literature and the tie-ins with this, and that what we don't see with a justice-involved population is if they don't have that sense of safety, of trust, then none of the great work we're doing with Spot the Dog is going to take any traction. If our clients, because they're so dysregulated due to chronic trauma, are stuck in their amygdala when they come to visit you in the office, I don't care if you've got Dr. Gee himself doing an intervention. If someone's unable to access their prefrontal cortex, where that abstract thinking occurs and that problem solving occurs, it's no wonder why we don't get the results we want, even with these evidence-based practices, because the practitioner, through no fault of their own, they weren't trained, doesn't realize, oh, you're attempting this cognitive intervention with somebody who feels dysregulated right now because they don't trust you, or they saw their cousin be arrested in the probation office last week and they're looking over their shoulder waiting for the police to show up, or they live in an impoverished situation where they don't know where they're getting their next meal or where they're sleeping. And then the well-intentioned probation officer will come back to you and say, boy, I'm doing STICS, I'm trying CBT, but it's just not working. It's because we're not creating that sense of safety for the client. Yeah.
Agreed. And then also being flexible and knowing that you may be prepared to introduce Spot the Dog to the client. But if you sense that there's some resistance because the client is not ready, you need to be able to roll with the resistance and pivot in another direction and allow them. I started in a training where the facilitator used the analogy about the GPS. That whenever you're driving someplace and you decide that you know where you want to go and you want to drive straight, but the GPS want to take you another route, but you disregard the approach that the GPS is telling you to take and you continue it, the GPS doesn't get upset. The GPS never says you're so big and stupid or telling you to go right. What the GPS does is it reroutes. It reroutes and it changes the directions and it gives you another option to take. And the same principle can be applied with our clients. And when we are faced with these resistance or we want to introduce X, but the client is not being receptive, we need to be able to be flexible that we can pivot in another direction to help our clients to find out what is it that they may want to focus on and allowing your intervention to be client-centered and not centered around the probation officer. Because we have the tendency to dictate, do A, B, and C. But I believe that true and lasting change occurs when it's internal versus when it's external. When that client makes that collective decision that I want to move towards X, Y, and Z, you tend to get more buy-in. The information tends to be more sustained because there is that internal locus of control rather than that external locus of control. And we try to empower that internal locus of control to ensure that our clients have the ability that any change or any intervention that is delivered, it is sustained rather than it just being temporary and you trying to check off a box to say, I facilitated spot the dog. But no, the objective is not to facilitate spot the dog, but to help the client understand what is exactly going on and being able to make the connection with the thoughts and how it's influencing their behavior. Because once they make the connection, then they will realize that my thoughts are influencing my behavior. So ultimately, if I want to change my behavior, I need to change the way that I think.
It is music to my ears to hear a director bring that mentality, because my fear is that too often we do fall into, and you just used the words there, I believe, this sort of check the box mentality where, and now I see, okay, the good news is you brought me in as a trainer to the agency to train you on these evidence-based interventions, but now you're almost from an administrative standpoint setting a quota of, okay, do X amount of interventions every month on your client, whether it's going to land on them or not. So it's music to my ears to hear you say that you're not approaching this just to check the box and move on to the next goal.
Well, yeah, and we try not to micromanage our probation officers, but to give them the flexibility to fail and to feel comfortable at failing, so that if they're doing something wrong, we can at least know. Because I remember when I was a probation officer, I was so afraid to fail that I used to cover it up. I never felt comfortable being able to record a session or to say I failed. But I believe in developing an atmosphere where your staff feel empowered to fail. That if you do something wrong, because I believe that if you fail, then you would know exactly what you did wrong and how to change it. But if you never actually being open or you're not being in an environment where you can fail, then how would you expect to grow? So for us, we believe in coaching. So a lot of what we do with our staff is being able to observe what they're doing, having that flexibility that I can sit in on some of the sessions that they're doing and be able to provide feedback as to how you can do something differently. Because I believe wholeheartedly in that role-playing kind of thing that people learn by doing and rather than saying. And then we also, one of the things that we adopt inside of the department, because we're kind of small. I mean, we're small now, but we're expanding. We have so many other new developments that are on the horizon that we are doing to expand. But being able to allow the staff to feel a part of. So I'm keen that anytime I go into a meeting, I'm taking a probation officer with me. Whenever the probation manager goes into a meeting, she's encouraged to take the staff so that whenever something is introduced, they also feel a part of that. Once they feel a part of that whole process of developing it, so that once it's introduced, they actually have that ownership that I help contribute to the development of this particular venture that we're embarking on.
I love that sense of almost co-elevation where you're bringing the staff member with you. You're really doing everything right down there, Jaron. You really are. Even when you said something earlier that put a smile on my face, something along the lines of you adopting that sort of fail forward mentality. Oh, I remember what it was. I was actually talking in my interview with Guy when we were addressing the issue of, at least here in the United States, sometimes I feel we get too obsessed with just focusing on contact standards. And we need to address this outdated notion that just maintaining contact standards, just seeing a client at their home or in your office, it doesn't wave a magic wand that reduces risk. But I think from a system standpoint, that's still how we're so geared. So I asked Guy, I said, Guy, what does failure look like? If you were to ask the average probation officer in the United States or Canada, what does failure look like? If somebody says, oh, can you believe he got fired? What happened? Most POs would say, oh, he wasn't seeing his clients. He was missing contacts. He went months without seeing clients, right? The answer to what does failure look like is never, oh, I didn't do enough cognitive behavioral interventions, or I didn't successfully probe that client's ambivalence around change, or I didn't augment their identity. It's always, no, I didn't see them at their house enough times in a month, and that's why I got fired, or that's why I got in trouble. So I guess I'll ask you, as the progressive director in the Caribbean, what does failure look like, or what's the message that you want to get to your new young progressive staff members about sort of their raison d'etre or whatever? Like, what does success look like? What does failure look like?
So I believe that it is important to put certain guards in place in terms of how you supervise someone who is high risk in comparison to those who may be low risk. So for us, we do have contact standards, but we have the flexibility that if you believe, in your professional opinion, that this person's criminogenic needs are being addressed in a manner that you think they're working. So if it is that someone is high risk and you're supposed to be seeing them 3 times a week, but before they came to you, they were unemployed, they were not involved in structured activities, but now they are actually working, where they have a job where they're actually being associated with pro-social individuals. And then on top of that, they're now involved in extracurricular activities where they go to soccer and play basketball and play dominoes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So now you realize that when they came to you versus where they are now, there is a difference between when they came to you unstructured, and so now they came to you structured. But yes, they were assessed as being high risk, which we said that you should have been seeing them at least 2 to 3 times per week, depending on the circumstances. But now you've addressed a lot of the issues, and so it may not necessarily be needed to see them 3 times per week. You may opt to see them every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks, or every 4 weeks, because of what it is that you're doing. So we have guardrails in place, but it's flexible. The probation officers know that it isn't that you will get punished if you don't see this person 2 to 3 times per week because they're high risk. The overall goal is to try to address the criminogenic needs. And if you've addressed those criminogenic needs, that's all that we are focused on. It isn't so much trying to tick a box, being able to ensure that you are meeting a specified need and you can justify the need that you've met, how you've met it, to ensure that the client is actually benefiting. But we've also had some clients who've worked and were involved in activities, but we realized that there was a relapse. They probably became unemployed. So if you realize that their time is not structured, then they have the flexibility to increase, because ultimately we are about public safety and preventing reoffending. So if it is that someone has less structured time, you may want to increase your time with that individual to ensure that they are engaged in services, to ensure that they're being referred to agencies to provide that type of support. So we have that flexibility. But I do believe, especially with some probation officers, that there should be guardrails in place, but there should be flexibility in how it is done.
It almost sounds like, Jaron, you're adopting a little bit of what we refer to here as dosage probation, where you're linking the duration of probation with what they accomplish versus just checking the conditions that the court imposed.
Yes. Yeah. And it's all about, we always use the analogy that if you were the client and you were trying to get help, would you get help if you have an issue with so many issues going on in your life? Would you be able to maintain that and trust an individual if you're seeing them once every 6 weeks for 20 minutes? And the focus of when you see them, you focus on, are you still living at that same address? Has it changed? Phone number changed? Or would you be more inclined to open up to someone who is actually concerned about your well-being? How have you been since the last time I've spoken? Actually remembering some of the conversations you've had with an individual and saying, I remember the last time we spoke, your mom was ill. How is she doing now? So being able to develop that therapeutic alliance with the client so there's a level of trust so that you can actually get that buy-in and they can see you as an agent who wants to support them and not as someone who is there to enforce or to police them around. So I'm more concerned about the relationship the probation officers have with their clients as opposed to trying to check a box. I want to be able to see when a client comes here that if they're in a crisis, like I had one of the staff was saying, this client left. He's not on probation a year ago, and she was complaining that he had a crisis that he called. I said, have you thought about looking at it this way? That he is in a crisis, but he's calling you because he believed that you have the ability to address and help him with that crisis. He could have turned to go and commit a crime. He could have gone against all of the skills and the intervention that you spent 18 months trying to teach him. So now he realized that you are a source of strength and you are a supporter. So he's calling you now because he has a crisis and he thinks that you can help him to resolve those crises. So I won't take it from a negative standpoint. I would take it that he sees that he's in need and he sees that you can help him to overcome the need.
I had the opportunity a few years back to do some training in the Middle East, but we were training prison officers on dynamic security, aka the Norwegian model, as a lot of folks think of it. But when people ask me what that experience is like, and you just described it, Jaron, I said it's the key to dynamic security. It's in a nutshell, it's relational versus transactional. Everything we typically do in probation and parole is transactional. You committed this crime. Okay, the transaction is we won't send you to prison if you abide by these conditions. And then me as the PO, that's transactional relationship. If you abide by these conditions and I monitor these conditions, then in exchange, you won't be incarcerated. Whereas the dynamic security model is all relational. It's just what you said. Well, you trust me. You care about me. You're not. I'm not a box that you're checking or a task. Again. You know my name and not just my offender identification number, that type of thing. Or that I have a sick mother or vice versa type thing. Yeah, it's relational. And that's the key to success.
Yeah. And even for me, we try to use sanctions and rewards as well. But one of the most satisfying is when I'm hearing some of the clients do something good. And so when I come into the office in the morning and I meet them sitting in the lobby, I can actually say, I've heard you did X, Y, and Z. Congratulations. And sometimes hearing the staff say, they come in the office and he was like, I can't believe Mr. Harvey even knew that I was able to do X, Y, and Z. And so being able to celebrate and to reinforce some of the positive things that they're doing, it helps them to actually want to dive into to have a better relationship with their probation officers. So a lot of times, from our clients, even from a prison perspective or even from a policing perspective, things that police and prison officers can't get our clients to do, we can walk in and just say X, and then it's done. Mm-hmm. I remember in 2020, we did a survey of the prisoners at all the prisoners, and we surveyed all of the prisoners, and so we were debating how we were going to do this. Should we let a prison do it? Or should we do it? Because we felt as if the prison do it, maybe the people might be as responsive, maybe not. But we realized that was their territory, so we wanted to give the space. And so we gave it to them, and they went ahead and tried to give it out. And so they came back, and they was like, the prison officers, they're not interested. They don't want to do the survey. And so 10 minutes later, we met as a team, and we said, okay, we are going to go. And when we went and we distributed the survey, the responses we got was overwhelmingly different in comparison than what the prison officers get. And the only difference is when we didn't went in a manner of saying, hey, see this paper, fill that out. We went and introduced ourselves, asked how are they doing, trying to develop that professional alliance and being able to explain. We've heard you been complaining that this is going wrong, this is not going wrong. This is that form that could give you a voice. We want to hear from you so that we can develop and write a paper as to what are the issues affecting you. And we got 100% response, positive response from those individuals. And the reason why we got it is because they felt empowered. They were given the knowledge. They felt empowered to want to participate because we actually put it in their hands to say, this is your voice. And we want you to put your voice on paper to help us to know how we need to create change. And all of that boils down to a lot of criminal justice systems is very punitive and believe that they don't have rights and they're not entitled to rights. And so we believe in explaining. There's an explanation for everything. Anytime you meet with a client, you need to conduct that role clarification. What are your rules? What do you expect from them? What they should expect from you? Being able to lay that down as the foundation to help the client to know that these are the expectations, these are the rules, and then also asking them, what do you expect from me as your probation officer? So giving them that voice and helping them to feel empowered despite the negative crime that they would have committed, but realizing that even in the midst of them committing a crime, they are still one, human beings, and two, they still have a voice, and three, they still have rights, and we must not trample on those rights. We must still abide and give and allow those voices to be heard. And so that's how we do it in the context of the Turks and Caicos, being relationship-based and helping to empower our clients so that we can develop that professional alliance. And so a lot of times, we sometimes have families who think they're on probation. One of the probation officers just said that with a juvenile, that I feel like I'm a counselor for the mummy. And I said, sometimes that happens when you're dealing with juveniles because you have to involve the entire family. And so now the probation officer feels that whenever the mummy's in a crisis, whenever she's having a rough day, she's calling the probation officer because she sees her as something that's positive. And so I said, what you are doing is you're not only transforming the client, but you're also transforming the entire family. And if we want to create systemic change, let's focus on transforming the entire family.
What a powerful statement, Jaron. Jaron, you mentioned developments on the horizon earlier. I guess I'll close with this. Look into your crystal ball, my friend. And if I've got you back on the show, say in 3 years and 5 years, what do you think we might be talking about as far as probation down in Turks and Caicos?
I think one of the things we'll probably be talking about is the implementation of our halfway house, which will be managed. It's a drug rehabilitation facility that will be for clients who are on probation and have a housing issue. One of the issues we met on day one, and so we have a halfway house that is about 70% completed that we hope to open within the next year. Two, being able to open our juvenile rehabilitation facility, which would focus on helping to transform juveniles who are sentenced to a term of imprisonment, being able to empower these individuals so that when they leave our system, they are not leaving worse than they came, but they are leaving better. And so having a dedicated facility dedicated to juveniles, implementing that. And then also probably introducing electronic monitoring to improve our bail supervision, which is something that we hope to introduce, pre-trial supervision, because what we are finding is that because there is insufficient court and the cases are sometimes being heard years out, a lot of these individuals, when they are sentenced, you don't have any time to work with them. And so as a result of that, you are not necessarily addressing their criminogenic needs. So part of that is being able to provide pre-trial supervision, which could sometimes last up to 2 years. But while you are providing pre-trial supervision, you are still assuming that these individuals are innocent until proven guilty, but at the same time, helping them to realize that sometimes the way that we think could lead to our involvement in these activities, and at the same time, helping to address some of the issues that could potentially lead to them to be entangled in the criminal justice system. So those are three areas that we could foresee us discussing within the next 3 years. And then, of course, with the department being restructured in a manner that probation is completely separated, parole is not completely separated, but there's a probation unit, there's a parole unit, so probation officers will not be doing both. And then I also would think that we would be changing our parole ordinance, which was written in 1976, to make it more revised with the 21st century driven, and then almost making it mandatory for individuals coming on a prison to be on a period of supervision, as opposed to coming on a prison and not being on any supervision, because we've seen, based upon a study we've conducted, that individuals who come out on parole in comparison to those who don't, those are the individuals who tend to be more successful. And so changing the law to make it mandatory for these persons coming out to be on a period of supervision that can help our criminal justice system. So those are some of the areas that we will be focusing on over the next 3 to 5 years when we get to speak. And hopefully at that time, we may be inviting you to the Turks and Caicos to attend the Caribbean Association of Probation and Parole and to actually conduct a podcast and interview some of the directors of the probation and parole in the Bahamas, in the Cayman Islands, in Barbados, in Belize, in Jamaica, in St. Lucia, so that you can hear from them what are they doing inside the Caribbean in terms of probation and parole.
I look forward to it, Jaron. I look forward to that. Speaking of professional conferences, I'll ask you this real quick. Is there a chance I will see you at the American Probation and Parole Association Learning Institute in Las Vegas this January?
I am still on the fence, to be honest. I'm still on the fence.
Okay.
I'm still on the fence. It's tentatively yes, but it has not been confirmed. So I'm debating whether or not we want to do that, or I wanted to actually use the funding to send some of the probation officers to other jurisdictions who actually have a successful probation and parole program, where they can actually spend a week understudying what they are doing, so that we can bring those tools and knowledge back here in the context of the Turks and Caicos to apply it. So I'm kind of toiling between which approach we will take. We've attended APPA conferences. We budget to attend every year, but sometimes I decide I opt not to attend to actually send some of the probation officers to other the probation departments to experience, which we would have had some of them would have the opportunity to actually experience Cherokee Probation Services, which was actually founded in 2019 in Georgia. And so they spent a week there actually learning about some of their programs and things that they were doing. And as a result of that, we were able to implement a case management system that they are using. We just implemented that case management system. So we transitioned from using paper files to now an electronic files. And because we are a archipelago, which means we have multiple islands, it made it easy. So we just had a client move from Grand Turk to Providence Iales, and so we didn't have to send a file on the plane. Mm-hmm. It was just a matter of reallocating the file from one supervisor to another, and then the supervision continued. And so there was continuity in sharing that information. So I'm all about equipping the staff with the best knowledge and the experience so they feel empowered. So I'm kind of toiling between, would APPA be best or would a twinning experience be best? So I haven't made up my mind yet.
You're going to explore that ambivalence further, but it sounds like you're making some good choices about resource allocation on there and the best needs of your staff. I appreciate that, Jaron. Jaron Harvey, a director of rehabilitation and community supervision from the lovely islands of Turks and Caicos. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to crossing paths again and hopefully learning some more from you and the amazing work you're doing down there in the Caribbean, Jaron.
Thank you so much. It has been my pleasure to have to actually participate in this interview. And I hope that the information that we shared would, one, help people to understand and learn more about the Turks and Caicos in the context of probation and parole. And then two, inspire your listeners to come and visit our beautiful by nature Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean.
I've added it to my bucket list, my friend. So we'll get that taken care of. All right, Jaron, take care, my friend.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's enlightening episode of the Criminologist podcast. I want to extend my deepest thanks to Jaron Harvey for joining us and sharing his invaluable insights into the transformative work happening in Turks and Caicos. It is clear that the future of probation lies in adopting a holistic, trauma-informed, client-centered approach, one that not only acknowledges the past, but helps to reshape it for a better tomorrow. From the implementation of the STICS practice model to the adherence of dynamic security themes and Jaron's passion for training and supporting his team, we have seen how evidence-based practices like the Risk-Needs-Responsivity framework can serve as a roadmap for change. It is particularly inspiring to see how Jaron is leading the charge by reshaping supervision through collaboration, compassion, and a commitment to community support. As we heard, true change doesn't come from checking boxes. It's about meeting people where they are, empowering them to take control of their own journeys, and transforming the criminal justice system from the inside out. Jaron's work reminds us that every challenge is an opportunity, not just for growth, but for true human connection and reform. For all of us working in the field, this conversation is a reminder of the importance of learning from one another, adopting best practices, and fostering environments where both staff and clients can fail forward toward success. So thank you again to Jaron and to all our listeners. Stay curious, stay committed, and as always, keep exploring the boundaries of what's possible in the world of probation, parole, and human services. Until next time, friends, this is Joseph Arvidson reminding you that there's no them, there's only us.
And so we had high school students actually presented speeches on how trauma play a role in effective offender rehabilitation. So for us, we realize, which is why one of our focus for next year, training-wise, is actually certifying our staff in trauma-informed care.
This has been a special APPA edition of the Criminologist podcast. Their international relations team looks forward to sharing the insights of other subject matter experts from around the world in future episodes. The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.